Sarah and Davis have chosen to write their own vows. So Sarah.
I promise to care for you and love you our entire life. I promise to be your best friend.
Whoa, 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 whoa. You can't just be saying best friend, okay? Pete's my best friend.
Hold up. I thought I was his best friend. We've been through a lot together.
Gosh, we have been through so much together. Second grade was really rough for us.
I remember when he fell off the monkey bars.
I mean, he gave me his fruit roll-up.
I mean, I gave him my fruit roll-up. That was like...
I hope he knows that he's my best friend.
Our friendship has survived so much. You think that this is gonna divide us?
I promise to be your most loyal friend.
I'm loyal too. She is confusing me so much right now.
She is my wife. He is my best friend.
Who's the best friend here? Who?
No one else, baby. Just you and me taking on the world.
Dude.
Aw, he's crying.
I'm gonna have to be gluten-free.
Oh man, dude, you go gluten-free. I have to be gluten-free. And I don't want to be gluten-free, man. It's the end of an era, Davis. It's the end of an era.
Yes, I am crushing these vows.
That is funny. That's funny. But poor Davis and Pete, they have no idea how much their friendship is changing in that moment, right? If you weren't here last week, you missed the beginning of our series we're calling Happily Ever After. And if you haven't heard that message, highly encourage you to visit our website, download our mobile app. You can watch and or listen to it there. Pastor Darrell did such a great job launching us into this. You don't want to miss that one. And we are focusing our attention on the most significant human relationship we can have because we want to succeed. We want to thrive in that relationship. But the truths that we are discovering extend beyond marriage, right? So if you're not married or you're not married anymore, these truths are still important for your life because with just a little bit of effort, we can connect the dots and we can make application into our families, into our workplaces, into our friendships. These truths are mostly about relationships and their specific application for marriages. Last week, Pastor Darrell's focus was really on this box, right? We come into our marriages with hopes and dreams and desires, and we carry this invisible box to the wedding day with us, and it's filled with different things like, you know, what kind of house are we going to live in, and what's that going to look like, and, you know, what color will it be? Every guy thinks about that. Here we go. You know, what kind of lifestyle are we going to have? What kind of car? Is it the sporty one or the family one or some kind of combination? How many kids are we going to have? How are we going to deal with conflict, right? And how does she handle it when I win all the time? Right? What do we do with our time? And then you realize, I don't have time. And so it goes on and on. We have all these hopes and dreams and expectations, and in and of themselves, they're great. They are good and positive things. They fill us with anticipation and excitement and energy. But then something happens when we hand these wonderful hopes and dreams and desires to our new spouse or we say, here you go, make it happen. I'm counting on you. Deliver. Right? Because these hopes and dreams and desires turn into expectations. And the things that kind of put a spring in our step and made us excited suddenly become a burden. And they become a weight tied around their ankle and they're trying to drag it around. You see, expectations are bad news because they usually, almost always, come with a you owe me clause. If I hope for something, and it doesn't materialize, it doesn't happen, then I'm going to be disappointed, I'm going to be broken up, and maybe I'll try again, and maybe I'll just move on. I hoped for it, it didn't happen, we deal with it. But if I expect something that doesn't materialize, that's a whole different deal. When I expect something and it doesn't happen, I'm going to hold the other person responsible. And there's going to be consequence, there's going to be punishment doled out because of that. And this creates that debt-debtor dynamic in the relationship that Pastor Darrell unpacked for us last week. When you owe me and you deliver, there's very little gratitude. You did what you were supposed to do, right? Let's move on. But if you don't deliver, there's always consequence. There's negative impact, and there's consequence in that. And when you are living with a you owe me outlook in your marriage, you will never reach happily ever after, because you will be constantly colliding with your spouse. Those hopes and dreams that have turned into expectations will collide. And last week, Pastor Darrell showed us 4 responses, typical responses when eyes collide, right? You can abandon, where you just split, I'm out of here. You can win, where you say, I'm going to get what I want in this situation. You can conform, where you say, listen, I'm just going to yield. I'm going to let you can have your way. As long as you're happy, I'm okay. Or you can compromise. And usually we think of compromise as the good outcome, right? You get a little bit of what you want. I get a little, neither of us gets what we really want, and so none of us is really happy, but we compromise. That's supposed to be the good thing. So those are 4 responses. Then near the end of the message, Pastor Darrell dropped a counterintuitive bomb on us, right? He gave us this principle. He said, happily ever after couples know this. Rather than living with you owe me, they live with I owe you everything and you owe me nothing. I owe you everything and you owe me nothing. And we said, that does not make sense. What are you talking about, right? We are told we're supposed to work for win-win scenarios where you get something, you win, and I get a little something, I win, and we're both moderately happy with that, right? That's compromise. What Darrell described to us is more like a give-give scenario. I'm going to give you a little bit, and then I'm going to give some more, right? And how can that create happily ever after? Maybe for one of us, but not for both of us. If I'm always giving, how does that create happily ever after for me? Well, we're continuing down this path because even though it does not make sense, this is essential for happily ever after. And it provides the power to make change in our lives. You see, the key that makes this dynamic, I owe you everything, you owe me nothing, the key that makes it work is the 5th response that we can have. There's abandon, there's win, there's conform, there's compromise, or we can choose to respond with mutual submission. Mutual submission. Responding with mutual submission is the key to ending expectations. It's the key to breaking that debt-debtor dynamic, and it's the key to minimizing collisions and all of these things that steal away happily ever after. The best, the strongest, the happiest marriages embrace a mutual submission lifestyle. So what is mutual submission? I don't know if you've ever been in this situation. You're stuck in line. We'll just say it's at Starbucks. You're stuck in line at Starbucks behind a starry-eyed couple, young couple, and they're sitting there, and they can't place their order because they're just, no, you go first. No, you go first. He said, wait. I love you so much. I want you to order first. And it's cute for like half a second before you just want to push them aside and order your coffee. Right? That is not mutual submission. Where they can't order, that's not mutual submission. Those people are terrible people. But that's a different topic. So mutual submission is rooted on something much more deep, much more powerful. It actually comes from something Jesus told his disciples at their last meal together. John recorded it in chapter 13. You probably remember this as we've gone over it recently. But he says this in verse 34, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." Now, we read this pretty casually, right? But it is hard to overstate the significance of what Jesus just said here. Jesus said he's giving them a new command, all right? New command. Now, there are different kinds of new, right? If I go and buy a new car, that means at least one other person owned it before me, and there's at least 50,000 miles on it. That's what new car means to me. To other people, it means brand new, like no one has even sat in it before. Brand new, right? Other times, when I'm buying something, I demand absolutely new. No previous owners, no prior usage, right? When I am buying underwear, absolutely new. No, there is no room for use prior to me. My mom, when I was a kid, actually bought me some underwear at a garage sale, and I proudly refused to wear it. I didn't even look at it. I'm like, no. Different kinds of new. You with me? All right? Well, in the language that Jesus was using, different kinds of new. One kind of new is numerically new, right? I've got another command, put it on the end of the list that we already have, like 600 plus commands. Put this one on the end, it's a new one. Then there's qualitative new, where this is a new kind, a new type of command. And that is what Jesus says here. I'm giving you a new quality of command. This command is to be held above in a separate class than all the others. And this is the command that we are to be living by in all of our human relationships. He says to love one another, that's not the new part, as I have loved you. Love one another in the way that I have loved you, Jesus said. Now, this is so profound and so powerful. It's been said that all the other writings in the New Testament, except maybe Revelation, all the other writings in the New Testament are simply helping us understand how to live this out. How do we know God's love for us, and then how do we love others that way? Everything else boils down to this and to following this command. And this brings us to our main passage for today. The Apostle Paul was the most prolific writer in the New Testament. He started out as a Jesus hater, Christian hater, but then he was radically changed when he encountered Jesus' Spirit on the way to Damascus. Eventually, he became the most significant figure in the first century there in the early church, traveling the known world, telling people the good news of Jesus, starting churches everywhere he went, and then he would periodically write letters back to them, helping them figure out, how do I love others the way Jesus has loved me? One of those letters he wrote to the church in Ephesus. It was part of the Greek world, now Roman world. We call it the book of Ephesians. All right, so we're in the book of Ephesians. He wrote this to people in Ephesus, and we're going to focus in chapter 5. In chapter 5, Paul lays out principles. How do you live out Jesus' command to love others as he has loved you, and in different relationships? And he sets the overall context. He says, all right, I'm going to set the stage right here. This is the overarching principle, right in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 5. He says, follow God's example. I like how some translations say, be imitators of God, right? Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children. Walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. You can hear the language mirroring what Jesus said. Love as Christ has loved. And so Paul directs us to imitate or to follow God's example here and to love others the way that Jesus has loved us. Well, this teaching, then all the teaching that follows in this chapter about different relationships flows out of this and is telling us, how do we do this? How do we imitate God in these different kinds of relationships? And when we get to verse 21, he introduces the section on marriages. And he does it this way. He says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. The command is submit to one another. That is mutual submission. Now, some of you may be thinking, wait a minute. I always heard the Bible said wives had to submit to their husbands, right? I was kind of counting on that. And it does say that. But before we can get to that point, we have to understand that everything Paul says about marriage and that relationship comes out of verse 21. Submit to one another. He doesn't say one, submit to the other. He says submit to one another. This is mutual submission. So let's get down to it. Let's get down to the nuts and bolts. What are we practically talking about with all of this? And Paul breaks it down into the two parts of a marriage. And he has instructions for the wife and he has instructions for the husband. And he begins with the wife. In verse 22, he says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. Can we get that up there? Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. That is a breath of fresh air, isn't it? Ooh, you're with me. That just feels good, right? You're like, ooh, I needed that today. That was nice. We're going to leave that up there. Let it soak in. You know, actually for some people, for a lot of people maybe, it's an uncomfortable verse. And it's one reason that you hear, fairly often, I hear it at least, that people dismiss Jesus and Christianity as outdated and irrelevant. They say, look, this is an obvious example of why it's not for us today. Submit to no, obviously. Now, there's different reasons that this tension comes from, that springs from. And I think, one reason that we feel this tension here is the difference between the 21st century and the first century. See, we could not read this more opposite. Our perspectives on this could not be more different. We read verse 22, and our response is, really? Like they still have that in the Bible? They didn't edit that out by now? Seriously? In the first century, they read that and they said, well, yeah, thanks for saying, yeah, duh. It's obvious. Thanks, Paul. And why? Why would we read it so differently at the point in history that this was written? In the Roman Empire, as well as in the Greek culture, even in the Jewish culture, the husband, the father, had complete legal authority over every person in the family as well as every possession. They had all power and authority in that family. And they could treat their possessions, they could treat their wives and their children any way they wanted to. And no one in authority would think twice about that. So wives were at great risk if they did not submit to their husbands. And so they say, well, duh, why would they do that? And this kind of prompts the question, maybe for you, it does for me, well, is the Bible reinforcing that dynamic? Is the Bible saying that's the way it should be? The short answer is no. And I'm confident that that'll become clear as we unpack this verse together. For example, you notice I have two words in brackets up there. Wives, submit yourselves. And those words are in brackets because in our oldest manuscripts, our earliest copies of Paul's writing to Ephesus, those words were not in there. It just says, wives, to your own husbands. Why? Why were they not in there? Why did we stick the words, submit yourselves to your own husbands? Why did we stick that verb in there? Well, that was a common writing technique and format of the day that Paul was writing this, that if you made a statement and then something, flowed out of that, you didn't need to put a new verb in there. You could just use the verb from the previous statement. So what was the previous statement? What was the previous verb? Submit to one another. Mutual submission. And so when we come to this verse, we stick submit in there because it flows out of that. Submit to one another. And wives, for you, that means submitting to your husbands. And husbands, we'll get to you in a moment. But he goes through this and unpacks this. The status quo said, wives, submit or else. It was fear-based. It was power-based. Paul says, submit to one another. And then he introduces a whole new, life-giving, inspiring reason for a wife to submit to her husband. More on that in a moment. Another reason for the tension that we feel at this verse, this command for wives to submit to their husbands, and we just have to be honest about this, is that for many years, the church, the universal church, failed. We failed to understand and apply this verse rightly. And it's a tragedy that this verse was taken and used for the purpose of subjugating wives to husbands. This was not God's intent when he told Paul to write this, when he inspired Paul. So what do you do? What do you do when you realize we've got this wrong? Like somewhere along the way, we got off track and we are not understanding this rightly. Well, you have to backtrack, and you go back far enough until you can get the right understanding. And when we go all the way back to the beginning, the founder of the church, that's Jesus, we see someone who showed incredible respect and expressed great value for women. Many times, Jesus' words and actions elevated women's perceived worth and value far above what was typical for their day and age. In the ancient world, women were not educated. They did not bother to educate women. But Jesus affirmed Mary for sitting at his feet in a formal learning capacity. And he said, no, I'm not going to take that from her. This is for her. In the ancient world, women were not permitted to speak in public. And they weren't even allowed to go out on their own. They had to go out with an escort or in groups. and only the worst kind of women were ever out on their own. But when Jesus encountered a woman on her own at the well in Samaria, he initiated a conversation with her. And he showed great kindness and respect all throughout that conversation with her. In the ancient world, women were held in such low esteem that they didn't even bother hearing a woman's testimony in court because it wouldn't matter. We can't trust a woman to give a testimony. It's crazy. But when Jesus revealed himself post-resurrection for the first time, it was to a woman. And then he sent her with the role as witness to the disciples. Jesus valued women over and over again. He broke from the status quo and showed great respect and value for women. And then you see his followers, especially that first generation, they led the world in elevating the perceived worth and value of women in society. In Galatians 3, in his letter to the Galatian church, Paul just totally blows up the gender divide. Because in the day-to-day ancient world, there were men and there were women, and there was a clear, better, and lesser categories here. But Paul says, listen, in the kingdom of God, there is no male or female. When it comes to the kingdom of God, we are all co-heirs, equal heirs to all of the blessings in Jesus. That is unheard of in the ancient world. On multiple times, the New Testament writers extend greetings to women, specifically naming them and giving them commendations for their contribution, for their significant roles in the church and everything that they have done and how well that they were leading and serving and ministering. These things did not happen in the ancient world outside of the church of Jesus. From just a cultural perspective, just from society, Jesus is the best thing that's ever happened to women and the way that they are perceived. Just consider how women are treated today in places in the world where Christianity has little or no presence. Women are still under the complete authority and control of their fathers and husbands. They're told when and where they can go. They're still treated as property. They are not allowed to vote. They don't have education. They can't even drive in some countries. All because there's little or no presence of Jesus there. Jesus changed everything. Jesus is the only reason that women are treated as they should be anywhere in this world. So when Paul tells wives to submit to their husbands, he is not affirming the status quo of his day. The directive is based on something beautiful and life-changing. But before we get to that, let's see what Paul says to the husbands. And he begins speaking to the husbands in verse 25. He says, husbands, love your wives. Now remember, 21st century versus first century. This time it's reversed. We read that and we're like, well, okay, thanks, Captain Obvious. Love your wives. We get it, right? They read this verse and they're like, wait, what? Love my wife. Did you say love my wife? You see, there are many things that the men in Ephesus might have expected. They could have said, men, be kinder to your wives. Men, take better care of your wives. Men, help your wives more. And they would have been like, oh, whew, that sounds hard, but we'll give it a try. Paul says it. But this being asked to love them was not on their radar at all. And we're not talking about attraction, romantic love here. Paul uses the Greek word agape. It is that unconditional love that is motivated only by the giver, not whether the receiver deserves it or not. It's the love that we only know because God has loved us that way. He says, love your wives that way. Nothing in their framework for living includes this notion of loving their wives like this. But that is what Jesus demands of them. It is what he demands of us, men. But Paul keeps going, and he raises the bar even more. Look at the second half of verse 25. He says, love your wives just as Christ loved the church. Again, we're back to John chapter 13. Love as I have loved you. Love your wives as Christ has loved the church. And they would have said, wait a minute, you want me to love my wife the way Jesus loved the church? I know that story. And it is not, it doesn't end well for Jesus. right? It started, he had to leave everything, right? He left heaven. It was a great place. He had all the honor, all the majesty. It was like nonstop praise and worship of him there. And he left all of that and came here to live a really simple life in Nazareth. It's kind of a, whatever. And it was hard, and it was humble, and it was difficult. And then he spent a lot of time with people they were not good people. They had problems, right? They were messed up. And they were the outcasts of their day. And then eventually, people beat him and killed him. Jesus gave up everything good and nice and took on all the discomfort and pain of this world. And he gave up everything. That's how you want me to love my wife? You want me to make that level of sacrifice for her? And then Paul would say, nah, you're smarter than I thought you were. Now you're getting this. But wait, there's even more. It's like a infomercial. There's even more. Skip down to verse 28. And he says this, in the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. Now, I can picture, they were kind of huddled around when they were reading this letter at Ephesus. Paul had sent it. They gathered to read it. They had some cheese and crackers and some wine out. And one guy was probably drinking his wine when they read this part, and he spewed it all over the guy in front of him or across from him. Because this would have been so shocking to them. I imagine that they're saying, wait a minute, you want me to love my wife like I love myself? I'm supposed to love her to that level? I imagine they had to start discussion groups to figure out exactly what Paul was talking about, where they would come and they would explain, it's just the guys, and they're like, all right, this is what happened this week. This is what I did. Did I handle it right? And the leader would say, Maximus, you are doing well. You are really making progress. I'm proud of you. Rudy, you are terrible at this. I don't know what your problem is. I don't know if you're trying. Right? And they would go through this and back and forth, and they're trying to figure out, because this was groundbreaking for them. Why? Because the commands of Jesus, what Paul teaches us here, means that husbands and wives are equal. They are of equal value, equal importance. And he says, if you want to love your wife well, you have to love her as much as you love yourself. Now, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around this because, we're kind of further along the journey than they were back then. But these teachings were like tectonic plates shifting in culture. They were challenging years, centuries and centuries of the status quo. And for too long, these verses to husbands were glossed over. And the two verses to wives were enforced with a heavy hand. And that is changing. And I'm so glad for that. We're recognizing that this is a mutual respect, a mutual submission to each other. It looks different between husband and wife, but it's mutual submission. Now, I imagine this may be stirring some fear in some of us, right? And you may want to tell me, listen, that was good preaching talk. That was good sermonizing up there, but you don't know my wife. You don't know my husband. If I submit to him, if I love her that way, it will be the end of me. And you may be right. But this is the counterintuitive part of it. This is the secret that makes this work. Why are we supposed to live this way? Why are we challenged and called to live this way, to sacrifice this way, to submit this way? It's not because our spouse is inherently deserving of your submission, right? It's not because you married the one man that's worthy of submitting to. And it's not because we have an enlightened cultural understanding of the value of women, right? It's not because of these things. We live this way because of Jesus. It all comes back to Jesus. Look at verse 21 again. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands because of what Jesus has done for you. Husbands, love your wives the way Jesus has loved you, the way he has sacrificed for you, the way he laid it all down for you. Love your wives like that because Jesus has done that, and he's asking you to do that. You see, when we have the right perspective on the depth and the extent of Jesus' love for us, the love that we've already received, it gives us the power to love others like He has loved us and to submit to one another. It empowers us to say, I am here for you, and you are here for me, but I'm not here for you because you're here for me. I'm here for you because Jesus has been there for me, and Jesus will be there for me. And we lay it all down because of Jesus. It may be the end of you that you know. But this is the secret to happily ever after that only a life surrendered to Jesus can bring. And after all, following Jesus is all about the end of the old me and embracing the new me that He creates in His image. The old me should always be dying and ending so that I can be the new me in Jesus' image. See, happily ever after couples are in a submission competition. They have their hopes and their dreams and their desires, but they do not let these become expectations because they embrace the lifestyle of, I owe you everything, you owe me nothing. And they embrace this and they live with this. And you're finding new and better ways to submit to one another. That's why this is for everybody. Whether you're starting off or whether you've been married for decades, we're always finding new and better ways to submit to one another. You know, I've wondered why God didn't give us a few examples, like a starter. Like, all right, wives, submit to your husbands. Here's a few ideas to get the ball rolling for you. Husbands, do this. Here's a couple ideas, you know. And then I realized two things. One, these are such encompassing principles that you can't, like the list would be unending. We should always be finding new ways to submit always to one another. Right? So this is just too big to list out. And then, if He did list out a few, in our human nature, we would say, all right, He gave us 3 things. I did those 3. Now I'm done. Right? I'm done. I have arrived. And so He doesn't. I think He leaves it open-ended because we have to search it out and we have to discover new ways all the time. And so here's my instructions for you. To go from here and to pray daily a simple prayer. Wives, you say, Father, show me how to more fully submit to my husband today. How do I do this? I might have done it well yesterday. I might have failed yesterday. Show me how to more fully submit to my husband today. Husbands, you say, Father, show me how to love my wife like I'm supposed to today. To sacrifice for her. To put her first. To love her as much or more than I love myself. Show me how to do this. As you're processing through these things and discovering new ways to enrich your marriage and to move more and more towards happily ever after, I hope that you will make time in your calendar for the marriage conference coming up in just a couple weeks on May 18th and 19th. That Friday night and Saturday morning will be packed with help and hope for every couple there. I've been reviewing the material in depth as we prepare for it, and I got to tell you, I've been through a lot of these kinds of things, and this is unlike any other marriage material I've been a part of and been exposed to. It is deeply gospel-centered, and it is powerful. You're not going to leave with like 3, marshmallow ideas, easy things to do. This will be deeply challenging to the core of who we are, and you will be changed by it. Whether you're dating and hope to be married, whether you're engaged, whether you're newly married, whether you're struggling or surviving or even thriving, you will benefit from being here. And I hope that you'll make time for it. Information, registration is all on our website. It's on our mobile app. It's at the info table. If money is the problem, please talk to someone. Let us know that, and we will make it available to you. When we follow God's plan for marriage, when we submit to one another, we can discover happily ever after. And we can be shaped increasingly into the image of Christ. Let's pray. Father, thank you. Thank you that you help us and you teach us. You give us the principles we need so that we can have the marriages that you make possible. But we need your help. We are bad at this. And we need you to help us understand more and more how to submit to one another. How do we do this? Father, help the wives learn how to submit to husbands more and more fully out of reverence to Christ. Father, help us husbands, please. Help us know how to love our wives the way you have already loved us through Jesus, to sacrifice, to lay it all down, to love them more or as much as we love ourselves. Help us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks, Dave. As the ushers come forward, we're going to collect our offering, and I just want to point out a few things that are happening in the coming weeks that will